Recently, I asked you all on Instagram to share your hot takes about the future of church.
So today, we're debating what you sent in.
We're going to debate each other.
We're going to debate you.
Let's dive in. Well, hey there, and welcome to the Pro Church Tools Show. We're here to help you and your church navigate the biggest communication shift in 500 years. I'm Brady, your host. I'm joined as always by my co-host. We call him Pastor Preserves. It's Alexander Mills.
Hello.
That time of year, living off of your presumed preservatives that you made in the summer.
Last night, I had pickled ramps on top of our venison tacos. So yeah,
Venison.
Yes.
You shot some?
And the ramps from last year.
Oh.
But the ramps from back in April, we've thoroughly talked about ramps on this show.
We have.
Still eating them.
We're not talking about ramps today, I promise.
Not anymore, that's it.
I recorded a YouTube video on this same subject that's coming out in a couple of weeks. But I got so many hot takes that were sent in via the question sticker on Instagram that I saved a bunch of them to debate here with Alex.
All right.
Now, as I was thinking through these hot takes, it did bring to mind an oft-quoted interaction that Jeff Bezos had with a reporter. I think it was Harvard Business Review. This was in 2007. And they asked him, they said, what do you think is going to change in the next 10 years? And famously, he responded, he's like, you know what? Paraphrasing here, I'm really more focused on what's not going to change in the next 10 years. And as we kind of go through these hot takes, these predictions for what the future of church might look like, just a helpful reminder off the top that what isn't going to change over the next 10 years almost certainly deserves more of our time and focus and emphasis than what will change. But let's be honest, that's not as fun as making some predictions and talking through whether or not they might be true. So, number one hot take, a downturn in big churches, small churches increase.
So these are coming in from your followers. You asked the question.
Yeah.
And somebody wrote in and said, downturn in big churches, increase in small churches.
Now, let's lay some groundwork for where we are right now. This comes from Faith Communities Today, the largest survey of American congregations in history. This was done in 2020, and it reported 70% of all congregations see 100 people or less in weekly attendance. Okay, so already small churches outnumber large churches. Here's what's interesting. 70% of church attendees go to churches of 250 or more. So what that means is most churches are small, and most people that go to churches don't go to those said small churches. Which is a really fascinating dynamic.
You have to sit and think about that for a couple minutes.
Yeah, every time I say it, we get a comment being like, wait.
Yeah, you can pause the YouTube video and just like soak in that for a moment if you need to.
So here's what's really interesting to me. What we know about Gen Z is that they are the least religious generation in history. And they're becoming less religious as time goes on. We used to hold the crown for this. And we as millennials are also becoming less religious as time goes on. So my big question to you is this even realistic or possible if we know that fewer people are attending church because they are less religious? Is the small church model even realistic and financially viable? Sure, it might make sense ideologically, theologically, but practically.
Yeah, that is a question that you and I talk about a lot personally, off air. This is a question I wrestle with personally, interpersonally, a question that we wrestle with at our church because we are one of these churches of less than 100 people. And that's the question that we come up against a lot, which is like, okay, as far as the complexion of our community and how we are embodying a faith community, we feel great. We love it. But the viability question is always the thing we come up against, which is like, okay, financially, how long is this viable? And I've been working in church now for 10 years, pastoring for a lot of those. And then also, you know, with my work here at Pro Church Tools, talking to so many different pastors, so many different people who work at churches all over, not just this country, but the continent. And this is the question that I think about probably more than most. And not just in the context of our own church, the church that I pastor, but just most churches in America, because we know that they're this size. And where I find myself kind of resolved today is this idea of maybe they are not viable in a sense of like longevity is concerned. Churches of 100, 200, 300 years like we've known, but maybe, just maybe, that's okay. maybe it's okay for a church to be seasonal. If this small type of congregation, this small type of community is what millennials desire, what Gen Z desires, and if they are pushing back against the large church model, maybe it is okay that that type of community is seasonal and doesn't exist for centuries. That's a hard thing to reckon with because I can't imagine closing the doors to our church, but our church is made up of a specific group of people who live in a specific place at a specific time. And if we were to grow out of that, like, I think we would close the doors to our church. And I think we would move on to wherever we found our next community, and we would find people of faith there too. So it's like, it's a hard thing for me to wrap my head around, but I'm wondering if that is what this looks like. Like, not temporary communities in the sense of like lasting 4 months or like single digit years, but maybe a church community lasts for a couple decades because people grew up in faith together in a place, but then they move on because of whatever reason. And maybe that community dissolves and they rebuild a new community wherever they go.
I think my practical approach is going to come up a number of times in these hot takes.
Sure.
Because I look at what people are saying and I think to myself, sure, like on paper, I understand where that's coming from. Mm-hmm. But then my question is this realistic? Mm-hmm. And and this is why I wanted to debate you on these things, because the way that I view you is that you come to things and you're like, you know what? The Lord? and you know what? One thing I've heard more and more on podcasts and from leaders that I admire is, hey, God's not calling you to be effective. He's calling you to be faithful. And I nod my head and I go, yeah. And I go, but
yeah.
and mostly in respect to just viability and practicality. And we often push for effectiveness on this show and in the content that we make. My take on that would be it's always effectiveness, assuming faithfulness is being upheld.
Sure.
If you're not being faithful to your own convictions, to the Word of God, to your calling, then that would no longer be effective, almost certainly. But it's just really challenging because I don't know how to reconcile these two things. So let's get to the next one because it kind of carries on. And what I tried to do when I was picking out the hot takes for this specific episode was I chose ones that came in more than once. So what you're seeing here are like, these were the big trends, and we got a ton of responses. So here's the next one. Next gens will ditch LED walls and seek more simple productions. I think this one came in more than any other.
Wow.
And I could not disagree more. Now, I think one thing that I've come to appreciate now as someone in my 30s versus someone in my 20s is how much you change from one decade to the next.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating is when we as millennials were being talked about in the way that Gen Z gets talked about now. Hey, this is the next generation in church. This is what they're going to look like. This is what we can expect. It's fascinating to see the commentary and the narrative around us then and who we are now and what we became and how not necessarily exact those things ended up being. Perhaps that's because of a global pandemic.
Yeah.
I think it's more to do with just like you age and your priorities change as you and you have to make choices. A lot of people, I've heard some pastors say, "Hey, is anyone noticing like millennials are coming back to church more?" And I was like, "Yeah, like we all had kids and realized, oh my gosh, the family needs the Lord."
Yeah.
And yeah, it wasn't perfect, and I had all these like gripes in my 20s, but like, hey, for the most part, this is great. Let's go back if maybe we took a break for a little while. I have this quote here in respect to this from Camille Paglia: "Sneering at religion is juvenile, symptomatic of a stunted imagination." And it makes me think about this trend towards agnosticism, this trend towards a-religiousness, and how it might be a lot to do with just the age of folks. And surely there's a different trend across generations. How much does cultural Christianity play into that? But I'll get into why I think that this is not going to be the future of what we see. As someone who famously hates LED walls and fancy production, rah from you?
Well, like my first instinct when you read this one was like, oh, I'd love to know the demographics, because you said this was probably the most frequent one that came in. I'd love to know the demographics of the folks who wrote these in, not just like their age, but what where they live geographically. I'm curious what impact like suburban versus rural communities and people who live in those areas, or like big city centers. Like we're just down the road from Toronto, the biggest city in Canada, one of the most multicultural cities in the world. What someone my age or what the average Gen Z person would say about what they desire from church in downtown Toronto would expect from church compared to someone who lives in rural Niagara and wine country. I think that actually plays like a really big role in the disposition towards what they're looking for, what folks are looking for from church. Just because like, I think what you look for from any community is informed a lot by your rhythm of life outside of that community. So if you're downtown Toronto, you don't own a car, and you're an artsy folk, or you're creative, you work at a startup in Toronto, like it makes sense that when you're looking for a faith community, you would probably want one that is synonymous with the rest of your work week. Like if you walk past Yonge and Dundas every day, you may, and you're inundated with like all this LED tech, and like the city's amazing. We took Asher to the city a couple weeks ago for the first time, like as an aware person. He's 3, and he was just he couldn't stop from looking up, just because he's seeing scale of things, buildings and advertisements and sounds and cars and trucks like that he's never seen before. And so my instinct is that if you live in a place like that, you're probably drawn towards a community that is a little bit bigger, and in some cases, as far as technology goes, better than folks who live where I live, which is like, former Mennonites or retired farmers, or folks who were born and raised in small town Niagara-on-the-Lake. I wonder aloud if where you were born and raised or where you're currently living has a lot to do with what you're expecting from a faith community.
The reason I was skeptical of this is because I don't believe that we lose our desire for production value. I think it gets expressed differently across different generations. But the root of the human nature remains the same. So here's like one example of that. Millennials are famous in interior design for like just painting everything white.
Right.
And
welcome to either of our homes.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, look at where
honestly.
So Gen Z comes around, and they've been like, millennial white is soulless. And it's fascinating on TikTok seeing like the passion amongst people 10 years younger than me for like their first apartments. And I can't, like, so many of them are like, they're not buying stuff from IKEA, right? Like they're getting like these antique things, and they're spending a ton of money on like coffee table books and like the perfect lights. And they care so much about selecting certain pieces. And I imagine if those same people went to a church and they went to a giant like aluminum box with all of these like big lights and stuff, they'd be like, I do not like fancy production. But then if they went to a place that spent the same amount of money, time, care, and creative energy on like crafting an intentional space full of like beautiful design pieces. There's not a single thing from like IKEA. There's nothing stock. There's nothing that's like not handmade or curated or boutique, whatever it might be. And they're like, see, no production value here. To which I would say, this is the exact same amount of budget and creativity and effort and idolatry on the worst side of things being spent here. It's just being expressed in a different way. And then the other cynical part of this would be like, what is the most popular thing that happened this year? The Eras Tour. It was way more popular in movie theaters than anyone expected. It was, of course, maybe the biggest tour like ever, or at least in decades. Yeah. Taylor Swift is the most popular human on planet Earth.
Honestly.
And I've seen the movie, have you? Like, it is incredibly high produced, and it's all just young people screaming. And what happens, I remember when I was a young person, you go to church and you get a bit of taste for that, and you're like, wow, we're doing this, but we're doing it for the Lord. And it feels like this thing that I enjoy outside of church, we can do that, but instead of putting our mind and focus on a celebrity, we can put our mind and focus on God. This is a noble thing. It's a virtuous thing. And if you look at just like all of Christian history, there's just so many times where people wanted to do big things for God and then did it with the expression of scale and spectacle. And so to think that we are going to just like eliminate that or remove that desire is something I'm very skeptical of.
Yeah. So as you say that, and I agree, actually, because houses of worship boasting scale and spectacle precede the LED wall by thousands of years.
Exactly.
Right. You and I have been going, I've been messing with you a little bit because you've been doing the series on the most beautiful modern churches, which objectively those buildings are beautiful.
Yeah, every time I was just like, oh, another ugly one.
No, I'll just send him I'll send him a cathedral that's like, hundreds of years old to be like, no, it's Gothic architecture. This is what we need. But those buildings, like for most of human history, the church, the steeple has been the highest point in the city because it's meant to draw attention towards the heavens. If you walk into any well-designed cathedral or old house of worship, you'll know, folks who are listening who went to Catholic church with their grandparents or whatever, anyone, or still go to Catholic church, anyone who goes to a house of worship that's a cathedral style will know that they are grandiose. They are over the top with architecture and imagery to the highest ceilings you've ever seen. I don't know how you get a ceiling fan up that high, but they do it because the ceilings are meant to draw your attention up towards the heavens. The stained glass, it's over the top in a different way than the modern LED wall, but arguably for the same purpose, to draw our attention towards what we profess to be the greatest story ever told. So yeah, I mean, we've kind of opened the lid on this one a little bit to see that, like, okay, this attraction to spectacle or excellence or curation is not new. It's not even modern. It's the tale of human worship, and I'm still attracted to a more Gothic cathedral type thing, but that's my taste. And I think that's actually informed a little bit by my theological bent. But for folks who don't lean towards Anglican prayer books like I do and lean towards something a little different, well, then what they're looking for is going to be a more modern expression of that. So I think actually, as we've teased this out, I think you and I might agree on this one.
I think I'm going to come off as the bad guy in every one of these questions. I'm just trying to approach this as a realist.
Totally.
Everything that I'm presenting here, it does not bear on my personal opinions or preferences. Maybe opinions isn't correct, like how I would prefer to do things. Yeah. It's just this is what I kind of see happening. Because when I was reading through all of these responses, what I heard was folks that are working in church that are overworked and underpaid with these expectations that their church needs to look just like the church that has way more people and way more resources. And they're just like, I can't do this anymore. Enough. I want to go back to or go to for the first time to something more simple. And I was like, reading between the lines and feeling compassion for these people because I know what it's like. And then I was also like, does their opinion and posture on this match their congregations? Like, is the appetite amongst consumer Christianity that it seems like is declining, but is right now one of the main existing potent forms of Christianity in respect to tithing and donations? Right. And that gets back to viability. Yes. We have talked so much on this show about different models of church. Well, how are you going to support it? So
well, and that's to what I said in that first one about viability. For our church, the stakes are so low because we're not, people's livelihoods are not dependent on our church. We don't pay anyone. But for a church of 250 or more where you have staff and viability is a major concern because you don't want to be laying off staff. You take care of these people by paying their salaries. For us, it's if our house of worship has to close its doors, nobody loses a job because of that. So the stakes are a lot lower, and that's why it's easier for me to say that. It's the similar phrase of how much more difficult it is to turn a large ship than a small one. It's for us, we're just a little jet boat floating around. We can maneuver however we need to, wherever we need to go. But I do have, of course, sympathy for churches who have staff members and all sorts of volunteers that depend on the viability of that house of worship. That's something that our little house of worship doesn't have concern for right now.
One of the hot takes that I'll discuss in that YouTube video that's coming out in a couple of weeks was, and I tried to keep them separate in that video and this one, but a lot of them are they're coming from the same place, I think, was you're going to see more and more bivocational pastors. And that becomes a reflection of what you're describing here, right? We're more nimble and agile as a church because the pastor's compensation is not their livelihood. And so if that disappeared because we did something that by definition is not going to attract hundreds and hundreds of people, but is faithful to what we believe we are called to do, the risk becomes lower. But of course, you're also a church that owns their own building.
Yeah, that's true.
And so what we know about church budgets is that it's the staff and it's the building that costs the most. So we could, let's say, remove a big chunk of that if more and more pastors become bivocational. And from that same study, it had about 25% right now, pastors that are like part-time, they're bivocational. So we'd have to double that to get to more than half. Okay, that seems realistic in the next, 10 to 25 years. So then we remove that part of the equation in the budget, but we still then have the massive building cost, rent, mortgage, utilities, maintenance, improvements. So, again, how realistic is it? Let's move to the next one. Pastors have to be more like entrepreneurs or CEOs. When you become someone that runs a business, one of the things that you get told is, okay, there's the thing that you do that people find valuable in the marketplace. You have to be good at that. Now you also have to be proficient at running a business. I was listening to a doctor talk yesterday, and they were saying, when you're in medical school, everything is just about like medicine and biology. It's like, most of my job is sociology and being like a real person to people in crisis. And you have to be good at both. And I think we've all seen a doctor who acts a lot like a robot. Surely they're quite brilliant and proficient in medicine, but you're like, can you have some compassion or like acknowledge my feelings here? And they're like, that's just not what I do, because it's very difficult to do both things. This is also true of pastors. If we're going to talk about the future being smaller churches, the future being smaller budgets, the future being bivocational ministry, you're going to have to be like proficient at church. You're also going to then have to be proficient at running church, or someone else is going to have to be. I've heard this conversation discussed so many times. You either have to be like the entrepreneurial pastor, or you have to be dedicated to being that shepherd, and someone else has to be able to do that other part.
That's it. It is a new year, but I'm still going to continue quoting Eugene Peterson, only because this story from his memoir just marked me. He talks about early on in his pastoral career, he went to an evening meeting with his leadership team with the intention to quit, because he said, and I quote, "I'm just so tired of running this damn church." That's what he said. And that was it. He was doing so much more business ops work than pastoring that he was like, this is not, first of all, this is not what I signed up for. Second of all, this is not like who I am. This is not using my gifts. This feels like a betrayal of my time, my attention, my what I feel like I'm designed to give the people that are in my care. And it was that he shared that with his team, and they said, okay, how can we reorganize where can other people step up to make sure that you don't have to do A, B, and C, you can focus on being a pastor, and that saved his pastoral career. And so I think, like, because I know this feeling, I know what it feels like to have to do stuff that is outside of my scope of just skill, and a lot of that stuff takes from the pastoral energy that I want to spend.
Yeah, and
that just leaves you feeling like in a really frustrated position as a pastor. But I do understand how when pastors just pastor and the other stuff gets neglected, well, then that's no recipe for a healthy community either. So the only answer to this one, in my estimation, is a holistic community that decides to step up in whatever form or fashion, whether it's other staff members or volunteers, stepping up to do the stuff, the entrepreneurial or the CEO type behavior, if that's not your pastor's wheelhouse, so that they can be who they are designed to be, while the function of the church doesn't get neglected either.
One way I could see all of these things happening that I am skeptical of is if church attendance continues to trend down, and this is just the reality, the environment for change becomes a lot more like ready to go. I was listening to a book that was talking about innovation over the decades, and how in the 1940s, during the war, innovation dramatically increased without working hours increasing. Why? Because the necessity for change was there. This book also talked about how so much of the innovations that we have are from the military, because when they were working on things, they're like, either we die or we fix this.
Right.
And how like the bedrock of like the road system and the internet was all because the military was like, we are trying to outsmart another great nation in the world. We will take whatever you have. Whereas the rest of the world's like, we're pretty fine. We're not gonna like adopt something new. And we have been in a very comfy place as churches, maybe not for most of our lives, but for like the previous generations in terms of like a lot of people go to church, a lot of churches are viable just as organizations.
Yeah.
If that becomes continually threatened, I don't think these choices get made by election, but I do see a world where they are being made out of necessity.
Well, that was so many of us came to that point in March of 2020, right? A global pandemic, this shared grief kind of shut down a lot of our normal operations and gave us a lot of space and a lot of reason to ask these questions for the first time. For us, I've shared this on the show before, but for us, we got some space from church. We weren't meeting in person, and a lot of us who were working really hard in church, bearing a lot of the load, realized, oh, that was too much. We weren't doing that very well before. I am breathing easier now, and so it gave us the space to introduce some new systems and structures going forward, equipping some other folks to bear some of that load, to do some of that work. And so now, on the other side of that, 3-4 years later now, our church, our community is feeling in a much healthier way. Folks like me and my dad, who's also a pastor at our church, are doing a lot less of that stuff. We've empowered other people to do it, but it took that global event to bring us to that point. Eugene Peterson, it took his church, him coming into a staff meeting saying, I'm done, I'm going to quit. It took that moment for them to reevaluate. So yeah, it really does require like it often is a moment that necessitates that kind of change.
Next hot take. This will be a quick one. It's mostly for you. Charismatic Anglican churches are going to explode in popularity and grow like crazy.
Hey, this wasn't me who wrote this in.
Okay.
But I'm so fascinated by this trend that I'm seeing. I'm not sure how many of our listeners are seeing, whether online or in their personal like faith expression, but this desire, I have called it, and I didn't coin this phrase, but like Eucharismatic communities, which are like this fresh faith kind of expression of charismatic Pentecostal faith, but also rooted in tradition and not scared of liturgy. And so that's the kind of community that we're curating right now at our church. And we're not alone. I know a lot of people, especially in the digital space, who are marrying these two expressions of the Christian faith together, like this active move of the Spirit, but also this rootedness in past and history and liturgy. And it's fascinating to me. It's life-giving to me, obviously, as you can tell if you're listening to me or watching me here. And I know that we're not alone in this. So I would have to agree that I mean, the questioner says are going to explode in popularity and grow like crazy, maybe, but certainly these communities are growing, and I'm encouraged by that.
Next up, great worship and kids ministry is the secret to growth in the future. Preaching not as important. So the reason I'm skeptical about this one again, barring dramatic change, is that I think this could only happen if a church's kind of typical order of service was changed dramatically. Because if you think about time spent, most time in a typical worship service is going to be on the preaching. If you have worship for 30 minutes and announcements for 15 minutes and then preaching for 40, right? Something like that. And then response for 15, whatever it might be. The biggest chunk of that pie is the sermon. So I don't see how those two ideas become congruent, because if they were, by necessity, we would then want to shrink the preaching time by a lot, right? Like if the biggest reason that people were coming, or the greatest value that we were giving to people's lives, was worship and kids ministry, does it make sense then to spend like the most part of the service on something that would, by what they're saying, not be one of the top priorities?
Yeah, I mean, this question and the way it's phrased reminded me of our conversation with Dr. Kara Powell when from the Fuller Youth Institute, when she talked about churches that are growing are disproportionately prioritizing young people. And that conversation has come up so many times in my personal life since we had it, just talking about church viability, church growth, kids programming and such. And again, our church pre-COVID, our sermon preaching was the majority of our gathering time, 30, 35, 40 minutes. Post-COVID, it's 20 minutes, 25 minutes. We have rearranged the order of our service a little bit, giving more time to prayer. We're praying through the Psalms. Sometimes I'll even just preach for 10 minutes and leave the other 10 or 15 minutes, give that to like some sort of spiritual practice, whether it's conversation or question time or interpersonal prayer, stuff like that. We'll do like guided scripture reading, like Lectio Divina. So we are toying with this. But the thing about that is, for our church, the kids are in during worship, and they only go out during the preaching time. So if you shorten down the preaching time, that also shortens the kids' ministry time. And that's actually been a little bit of a challenge to us. If we're only sending the kids out for 20 minutes, sometimes the teachers feel a little handcuffed, like, oh, we don't have enough time to do what we wanted to do. Or so it's really hard to prioritize one of these and not the other. And it's really hard to deprioritize preaching if that's been a big part of the identity of your church community. It takes a lot of courage to also dramatically reshape your church service. And if you do it too quickly, that just feels like whiplash to people who have come to expect something from your church community. So it's really not easy to pull this off.
I'm just like starting to like add up all of these hot takes together. And again, these were the most popular. So this came in again and again, hundreds of responses. So one of the other ones I got that I lumped in here was the future will shift to focus less on the lead pastor. Okay, so we're not going to have as much of a focus on that one charismatic personality. Okay, and we're not going to have fancy production. So no scale and spectacle. Okay, and pastors are probably not going to be able to get paid because of the first two things. So it's all bivocational, and no one attends church either. That's young. And like, I just started adding these up together. And maybe this is because, I did not pursue being a pastor because I did not have the relational bandwidth for it. Talk about like pastors needs to be both CEOs and like shepherds. The reason I immediately felt fulfilled in what I do is because as much as I like to write, I like to run a business. As much as I like to financially forecast, I like to like get in my creative lab and tinker. I couldn't imagine doing only one or the other. But exactly what this business requires is exactly how I am wired to serve it. So it's the business part of me that's coming out and being like, guys, I don't think all of these things are adding up. And if we just like reduce the whole thing to rubble, just declare bankruptcy on the whole thing, and then start building up from there, sure, we can reshape it. But if we're talking the future, like that's a 30, 40-year future. Like that's not a 10-year thing. Like, we're not just going to get to this place in 10 years. And a lot of these things, they require basically declaring bankruptcy on everything that we've done. Also maybe financial bankruptcy. And so that's where I'm just like, I don't know. I don't think human nature has the type of vision, discipline to basically say, hey, if we keep going down this road, it'll probably end poorly. So let's preemptively pull the plug and create a disastrous event so that we can reshape things from scratch on our terms rather than wait until the disastrous event happens by a million cuts and then just like go, because here's what's going to happen. Then we end up going down the street to the big church. The one that like, what I see in the future, the cynical part of me is like the gap between the biggest and the smaller churches, it just continues to grow. The 70% of smaller churches becomes 50%, and the 70% of people attending bigger church becomes like 90%. And we keep trying to do these models, but they're not financially viable, and young people don't care about them, and nobody goes, and then everyone ends up going to the big church. I'm not presenting any alternatives. So I'm not trying to say that like I'm right. I just worry when we add these all up that there's just one too many things in the ledger on the side of red.
Yeah, like when you phrase it that way, when you put them all together, it does sound like rather ideological, right? And the question, it begs the question, like, okay, great idea, but how?
And that's exactly where you would be if you're overworked, underpaid, exhausted, and the expectations just keep mounting. And every week I come up with an episode being like, here's what else you should do on social. Like, Brady, please stop.
Yeah. I also don't know how. And what I'm about to say is would be a great way to to end this episode. We're not going to end it. We got 2 more to talk about. But to what you said at the very beginning, which is like, I don't know how other than just being faithful to the people that you serve in your community.
Yeah.
So whether there's 10 people that come to your church, 100 people, 1,000 people, I don't know. There's people who are listening to the show who have 10 people that come to their church. People who have 100, people who have 1,000, people who have 10,000. So I don't care who you are, how many people come to your church. I don't know how other than being faithful every day you wake up to the call in your life, whether it's pastor or social media director or whatever, volunteer, layperson, I don't care. You wake up, be faithful to the journey with Jesus in your location, where you go to church, to the community to whom you belong. That's you can if your community accepts that call to be faithful to where Jesus is leading your community, you can pull any of these off where you are. I don't know how to do it on a global scale, on a national scale. I don't know. I don't know the future of the church, but day after day, Sunday after Sunday, week after week, year after year, staying faithful to the call of Jesus wherever he's calling you, whoever, all these people who wrote in. That's my best estimation on how. And that's local, that's specific, that's there's cultural context there. So hopefully that's encouraging, because that's all we're trying to do. And we're still here. We still meet every Sunday to worship God. And there are churches all over our local area who are doing the same thing. And their complexion of their community looks a little bit different. And that's great. They're faithfully meeting to worship God. And we all do it in the name of Jesus, not the name of anything else, not the name of celebrity or political power or anything. I think we'll be okay.
One of my favorite responses we got was just, it'll be fine.
There you go.
2 more here. Church denominations are on the decline, and we may see the end of them in our lifetime. So the trajectory on this, I think, is pretty clear. The rise of non-denominational churches has been huge in our lifetime. We're seeing denominations splinter because there's a hot button issue that they can't unanimously agree on. We're seeing corruption in denominations exposed, leaving people disillusioned, and the power of said denominations not really transcending past this generation because of the corruption. And we're seeing the rise of fellowships or networks where you're a part of a group of churches, but it's informal. You're not required to make the same creed declarations. Hey, if you want to be part of this, you have to believe this, this, and this. You have to give this amount of money to the denomination. And so the trajectory is definitely clear. I guess my question is, do we continue on that trajectory the way that we have for the last 20 years? Or, as this person is suggesting, or is there coming some type of swing back the other way of the pendulum?
I feel the swing of the pendulum in my own heart, in my own practice.
So you strongly disagree with this person?
I don't know. So I am becoming friends. We live right next door to a Catholic church, becoming friends with the priest next door.
Oh boy.
And so just learning a lot about not the Catholic faith, but the Catholic Church and how it operates. And our church is non-denominational. Our church was born out of a group of people who belong to traditional churches, United, Anglican, Catholic, who wanted to explore faith on their own. They started a Bible study. Poof, it's a church. And we belong to a network in Canada, a non-denominational network. And over the years of pastoring in that network, I've made some great friends in that network. I feel very supported by that network. But sometimes I long for a denomination, in the sense of longing for a united agreement on what we profess to believe, longing for a little bit more accountability. Not to say that any denomination is perfect at this or even good at this. And this is part of the problem. Denominations have proven to not be very good at this, which is why a lot of us pastor non-denominational churches. But there is kind of that this longing for a little bit more order in my own heart. So I don't know. I think yes. I think both and. I think we will continue to see. We don't have any stats here on non-denominational churches. I do think we'll continue to see more splintering from denominations, mainline denominations, popular denominations, resulting in non-denominational churches or independent churches. But I do also anticipate kind of a pendulum swinging back, maybe because the denominations that are losing folks realize, okay, we need to evolve here. We need to change. And maybe if they do embody some of that evolution or change, maybe some folks swing back to the shelter of a denomination. I don't know. So globally, I'm not sure, but I feel that personally.
Well, look forward to the Charismatic Church of Canada
There you
rising.
go. Yes.
Final one here. I think in 2024 and beyond, churches will either grow or close their doors. So this person is kind of going against the grain in respect to what other folks were suggesting, and was hitting on kind of what I see as like the shrinking of the church middle class in a lot of ways, where, hey, you're either going to be one of these big churches that has the resources and the size to sustain this like shrinking church attendance, or you're going to be small and you won't be able to sustain that type of hit and you're going to close. Or you might go to the really small side where, like, let's imagine it's like you, where you don't have any churches, pastors on staff, and either you own your building or more likely you meet in a home or you meet in a place that has almost zero overhead costs. And so you're able to withstand any sort of changes because, like, by definition, you're so small that you almost can't be hit by those things and aren't affected by them.
Yeah, I mean, again, we don't have statistics to back this up, but anecdotally here in the place where we live, I am seeing that very thing. I'm seeing churches close, both mainline and non-denominational churches, small, middle-sized churches. You'll see the building go vacant, and then before you know it, you'll drive by and, oh, the building's not there anymore. This is happening. There was one church building I had my eye on that closed, and then I drove by it the other day and it was gone. It's like, oh, I wanted that building. I missed my chance on it. And so I'm seeing that with my actual eyeballs. And again, interpersonal friendships, folks who belong to churches who are similar size to ours, who didn't quite make it through COVID or who are slowly dwindling after COVID and are not seeing much of a future for vitality there or longevity. And so not seeing a lot of those churches moving into new buildings or popping up here, popping up there. But there are a few very large churches in our area that have popped up recently and that are growing at a rapid pace. And so just anecdotally, I'm seeing that very thing here in the Niagara region where we live. I'd be really interested to read, and again, that study that we quote often, the faith community one, you said that was a 2020 study. Yeah. I'd be so curious to know like what kind of data there is coming out of that global pandemic and like the state of church sizes now and just the state of churches now. But anecdotally, that's definitely what I'm seeing.
I'm just trying to investigate some of my own bias on this because I grew up in a really small Baptist church. So like 20 people, no sound system. Pastor didn't preach with a mic, acoustic guitar, voices singing, but we did have an overhead projector.
Oh, cool.
And sometimes we had 2 acoustics.
Nice.
And I remember not enjoying church as a young child and as a kid, not enjoying any part of it, even though there were some kids my age. And then I remember going to the Pentecostal church in town, and they had what I would call fancy production.
Right.
They had drums. They had a sound system. They would turn the lights down for youth group, and we'd have like 3 colored lights. And I was like, this is different. And there were young people there too. But before I made connections with those young people, because there were people my age at the Baptist church, it was like church felt cool for a second. And as a young person, that mattered. It doesn't matter now, but it mattered then. And the fact that it mattered then shaped the trajectory of what has become now.
Exactly, yeah.
And so that's like the one thing like I'm really curious about. And I am very open to being, I don't feel like I have a good sense on this or a good feel because I feel like it's my own bias that might be clouding what's happening more broadly because you can only know your own experience. But if we went towards like all of these small churches, my fear would be like, I am going to the small church that is practicing everything faithfully. And then one day I get invited by a friend in school to go to the big church. And I'm like, wow. And then I go there as a kid. And then maybe I become a 30-year-old and then I go back to the small church. And maybe that's like the cycle of like, we need the big church and we need the small church. The big church, which is like attractional Christian fast food, which is like, hey, let's make it accessible for everyone. And then when you get like disillusioned with maybe its lack of depth or shallowness, Then you go to the small church that's like, look, we have nothing attractional. What we have is faithfulness. And maybe we need both. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Maybe I'm naive.
No, I don't think we're naive. I think
I said I'm naive.
Surely we're naive about something, about some part of this. I think the way that we talk about this on the show, we're navigating the biggest communication shift in the last 500 years. And that impacts even how we talk about church, because 500 years ago, before, or however many years ago, before we were so interconnected via communication, lines of communication, you were rooted in a place.
Yes.
And that's where you belonged. And that you went to the church that was near your place because that's where you did all your stuff. You know, you didn't travel beyond the boundary of your township or whatever. Like, there's a church here, we go here. And we're living in this meta-modern world now where that's just not relevant to us anymore who live where you and I live. That is relevant to people even who live in our country still. There are communities in our country where that is true. You live, you belong where you live. That's true. But for you and I, for most of the people listening to the show, if you're listening to a podcast, if you're watching this on YouTube, that is probably not relevant to you. And so the boundary of our experience has just exploded thanks to the way that communication has evolved. We have the internet. We know that there's another church on the other side of the town, and we've got an electric car to drive from this side of town to that side of town to get there. That just wasn't true for most of human history. So it's a new question. It's a wide open world now where for most of human history it has not been. And that has, I think we're learning that really impacts how we not just talk about church, but how we practice faith. Because for most of human history, you practice faith with the people you lived with. That in some cases is not true anymore. You know, there's a really large church in town, and a lot of people travel from outside of their community to come to that church. That's just the nature of big church.
Not me.
That's true. It is right down the street from us.
Which is nice because I used to travel out of town to go to the church. And
Yeah.
we're building a new building. I was like, oh, where's it? Hey!
Coming to you.
Guys, did you know I value attending church in your local area?
Yes.
You can't relate? Sorry.
So yeah, that's something, that's a topic of conversation I talk a lot about with friends too, is like, you know, a lot of these questions we're wrestling with are new questions, because of how communication has opened up our experience of the world. And so, but we're not going back. How many times have we said that on this show?
Yeah.
We're not going back. So how are we going forward is the question. How are we going forward? Because we are going forward. How are we going there? I mean, we're imploring you and I first and foremost, but everyone else listening, like, to go forward faithfully, and that's going to look different for everyone in their local context. For you and I, we both go to local churches, so that's a good.
We do.
Yeah, that's a good step in the right direction. I mean, that's all. That's like. I just wish we could have more foresight. I wish we could be more prophetic. You know, in a real sense. But we're just trying to be faithful one day at a time, wrestling with all of these questions, these things that we think may happen or may not happen. And of course, we'll look back in 10 years when we're 40 doing this podcast. 40. Like, wow, we were really wrong about that, right? But what you said at the very beginning is probably the most important, which is, sure, it's fun to talk about what's going to change, how churches are going to evolve, but what's going to stay the same? And maybe that'll be another show for another day.
Faithful one day at a time. I hope you enjoyed listening as we explored these topics. A lot less certainty in this episode than normal ones where we're talking about, hey, here's how this is working and here's what we should do about it. This is more like, what do you think is going to happen? And wow, as I explored these, how little I feel like I have a sense on what it might be.
Yeah.
So faithful every day. Thanks as always for your time, attention, and your trust. We'll talk to you next week.
Remember how to do this?
No.
Me neither. Okay.